In the shadows of East Asia lies a nation that is at once mysterious, feared, and misunderstood. A land that has defied collapse, survived famine, and outlasted enemies who predicted its downfall. Today, it is known as North Korea, officially the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. But its story does not begin with nuclear threats or the figure of Kim Jong-un. It begins centuries earlier with dynasties, invasions, and a culture shaped by isolation and resilience. For much of its history, the Korean peninsula was called the Hermit Kingdom. Guarded by mountains, seas, and its own determination, Korea often turned inward, protecting itself from the tides of Chinese, Japanese, and Western influence. This legacy of isolation would echo powerfully in the creation of modern North Korea. The seeds of division were planted in the ashes of World War II. When Japan surrendered in 1945, its decades-long colonial grip on Korea was broken. But instead of independence bringing unity, the peninsula was carved in two, the Soviets occupying the north, the Americans the south. In this crucible of occupation and mistrust, a new nation was forged in the north. Its leader was a man named Kim Il-sung, a guerrilla fighter turned revolutionary, who would establish a dynasty that continues to rule to this day. The story of North Korea is not simply about politics or borders. It is the story of a family that built a nation in its image. A dynasty that demanded loyalty not just to a leader, but to a bloodline. From Kim Il-sung, the great leader, to Kim Jong-il, the dear leader, and finally to Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader. Each successor inherited not only power, but myth. Together, they transformed a war-torn state into one of the most enigmatic and tightly controlled regimes the modern world has ever seen. And so, the tale begins, in revolution, in ideology, and in a struggle for survival that would define an entire people. This is the history of North Korea, a dynasty of power, secrecy, and unyielding control. Kim Il-sung was born in 1912, the same year the Titanic sank, and the same year Korea had already fallen under Japan's iron grip. His childhood was shaped by poverty, exile, and rebellion. The Japanese occupation of Korea was brutal. Korean language and culture were suppressed, schools taught loyalty to the emperor, and dissent was crushed. For young Kim, this oppression planted the seeds of revolution. In his teenage years, he crossed into Manchuria, where Koreans and Chinese were organizing guerrilla resistance against Japanese forces. Here, Kim Il-sung found his purpose. He became a fighter in the wilderness, ambushing Japanese patrols, living in harsh conditions, and building a reputation as a determined commander. By the late 1930s, he was leading units that carried out raids across the border. Though small in scale, these attacks became legendary in propaganda. To Koreans yearning for freedom, Kim was more than a fighter. He was a symbol of resistance. When World War II ended in 1945, Kim Il-sung returned to Korea with the backing of the Soviet Union. The Soviets saw him as a loyal communist and an ideal candidate to control the North. At just 33 years old, he was placed at the head of the emerging government in Pyongyang. Overnight, he transformed from a guerrilla commander into the face of a new state. But Kim Il-sung's ambitions stretched far beyond survival. He envisioned a united Korea under his rule, free of foreign influence. In 1950, he launched a gamble that would define the Korean peninsula for decades, the invasion of South Korea. With Soviet weapons and Chinese encouragement, the North Korean People's Army surged across the 38th parallel, capturing Seoul in just 3 days. For a moment, it seemed his dream of unification might succeed. Then came the response. The United Nations, led by the United States, intervened. American forces landed at Incheon, cutting off Kim's army and driving them back north. Pyongyang fell. North Korea teetered on the edge of collapse until China intervened. Waves of Chinese volunteer soldiers poured across the Yalu River, pushing the Americans back. The war dragged on for 3 bitter years, with neither side able to claim victory. By 1953, an armistice ended the fighting, but no peace treaty was ever signed. Korea remained divided, and the 38th parallel hardened into one of the most heavily militarized borders on Earth. For North Korea, the war was catastrophic. Cities were reduced to rubble, millions were dead or displaced. But Kim Il-sung emerged stronger than ever. He portrayed himself as the savior who had resisted imperialism and preserved the nation. Around him, a cult of personality began to grow. He was no longer just a leader. He was the great leader, the father of the nation, a figure to be revered. Through the 1950s and 60s, Kim rebuilt North Korea with Soviet and Chinese aid. Factories rose, cities were reconstructed, and the country even outpaced South Korea in early industrial growth. But prosperity came at a cost. Kim eliminated rivals, purged enemies, and demanded total loyalty. His ideology, later called Juche, emphasized self-reliance, independence from foreign powers, and the absolute authority of the leader. In practice, it bound the people to his vision and cut the nation off from the outside world. By the 1970s, Kim Il-sung had secured his dynasty's future. He began preparing his son, Kim Jong-il, as his successor, a move unprecedented in the communist world. While China and the Soviet Union had leadership struggles, North Korea was quietly becoming the first communist monarchy. Kim Il-sung ruled until his death in 1994, a span of nearly 5 decades. By then, he was revered not only as the founder of the state, but as a near-godlike figure. His statues towered over cities, his portrait hung in every home, his speeches memorized by schoolchildren. Even in death, he remains North Korea's eternal president, embalmed in a mausoleum, worshipped by generations who never knew a world without his shadow. When Kim Il-sung died in 1994, the world expected North Korea to collapse. He had been the country's founder, its father figure, and the axis around which its entire political system turned. But instead of collapse, something extraordinary happened. His son, Kim Jong-il, stepped seamlessly into power. North Korea had become the first communist dynasty. Kim Jong-il's rise was carefully engineered. For decades, his father had groomed him as heir. In the 1970s, his name began appearing in state media, often linked to great successes, though he was rarely seen in public. He became known as the Dear Leader, a title meant to complement his father's role as the great leader. Together, they formed a mythic narrative of continuity, the father who liberated Korea and the son who would guide it into the future. Unlike his father, Kim Jong-il was not a guerrilla warrior or military commander. Instead, his power lay in ideology, propaganda, and control of the state's machinery. He was obsessed with films, literature, and the arts. Under his direction, North Korean propaganda became even more elaborate, portraying him as a genius strategist, a master of culture, and a leader beloved by all. State media told fantastical stories, that he was born on a sacred mountain under a double rainbow, that he composed operas, invented new dishes, and shot golf with impossible skill. These myths were not intended to convince the world, but to create a sense of awe at home, binding the population into a shared story of destiny. But reality under Kim Jong-il was far harsher. The mid-1990s brought catastrophe. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left North Korea without its main source of aid. Then came a series of floods and droughts that devastated crops. By 1995, famine gripped the nation. Food vanished from shelves, and the government's rationing system collapsed. Ordinary North Koreans were forced to forage for roots, bark, and grass to survive. Estimates suggest that between 1 and 3 million people died in what the regime called the Arduous March. During this time, Kim Jong-il doubled down on control. He strengthened the Sungun, or military-first policy, ensuring the army received resources even as civilians starved. The military became not just a defense force but the backbone of the state, elevating generals and officers into positions of power. In this way, Kim secured loyalty even amid collapse. The famine, while devastating, also served as a grim test of endurance. Those who survived did so under his rule, reinforcing the regime's narrative of resilience. The outside world watched in horror. Aid agencies sent food, but strict controls limited its distribution. Smugglers along the Chinese border provided some relief, but also introduced forbidden foreign influences. South Korean dramas, music, and news began to leak in, challenging the regime's monopoly on information. To counter this, the state tightened its grip, punishing those caught with smuggled media and reminding the people that hardship was part of their sacred duty. At the same time, Kim Jong-il pursued something that would secure his regime against outside threats: nuclear weapons. In the 1990s, North Korea began developing its nuclear program, bargaining with the West for aid in exchange for limits, while secretly continuing research. By the early 2000s, it was clear that the regime saw nuclear weapons as its ultimate guarantee of survival. For a small, isolated country, possessing the bomb meant no foreign power could risk invasion without catastrophic consequences. Despite famine and international isolation, Kim Jong-il maintained an iron grip on power. His appearances were rare and theatrical, usually showing him giving on-the-spot guidance at factories, farms, or military bases. The myth of the dear leader continued, portraying him as both a fatherly figure and a near-superhuman genius. Inside North Korea, questioning him was unthinkable. Outside, he was often caricatured as eccentric, with his bouffant hair, platform shoes, and love for luxury goods. But these stereotypes overlooked a more dangerous reality. Kim Jong-il was ruthless, pragmatic, and deeply committed to preserving the dynasty his father had created. In his final years, Kim Jong-il prepared for the next succession. He elevated his youngest son, Kim Jong-un, into positions of visibility, echoing the path his own father had taken decades earlier. By the time Kim Jong-il died in December 2011, the succession machinery was already in place. The mourning was immense. Mass wailing and choreographed grief swept the country. For North Koreans, another divine figure had passed, but the dynasty endured. Kim Jong-il left behind a country scarred by famine, hardened by military first rule, and armed with the beginnings of a nuclear arsenal. His legacy was paradoxical: a weakened nation, but a regime stronger than ever. By surviving catastrophe, he had proven that the dynasty could endure anything: hunger, isolation, even near total collapse. For the Kim family, survival was victory. When Kim Jong-un inherited power in December 2011, many in the outside world doubted he would last. He was young, in his late 20s, and had spent much of his life in the shadows, studying abroad under a false identity and only appearing in North Korean media a few years before his father's death. Some analysts speculated that the generals or party elders might overshadow him, or that the dynasty would fracture under the weight of famine, sanctions, and internal resistance. But Kim Jong-un quickly proved them wrong. Within months of taking power, he moved to consolidate his rule with ruthless efficiency. High-ranking officials who might challenge him were purged, some sidelined, others executed in spectacular fashion. Even his own uncle, Jang Song-thaek, once considered the second most powerful man in North Korea, was dramatically removed from office and executed in 2013. These brutal moves shocked the outside world but sent a clear message at home: the young leader was not to be underestimated. Kim styled himself as a blend of his grandfather and father. From Kim Il-sung, he borrowed the image of a warm, charismatic leader, smiling, waving, and visiting factories with a seemingly approachable demeanor. From Kim Jong-il, he inherited the ruthless control of the state and the military-first ideology. State media began to present him as the supreme leader, a title that placed him at the pinnacle of power. His early years saw bold steps in North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Under Kim Jong-un, the regime accelerated its testing. In 2013, North Korea conducted its third nuclear test. In 2017, the pace reached a peak, with both nuclear explosions and intercontinental ballistic missile (ICBM) launches. By the end of that year, Kim declared that North Korea had the ability to strike the continental United States with nuclear weapons, a statement that shook the world. The response from abroad was dramatic. U.S. President Donald Trump engaged in a fiery war of words with Kim, trading insults like "Little Rocket Man" and "Dotard." At one point, the world feared nuclear war was imminent. Yet, in an unprecedented twist, 2018 brought a series of high-profile summits. Kim Jong-un met not only with South Korea's President Moon Jae-in, but also with Donald Trump himself. The images of Kim stepping across the border at Panmunjom and later shaking hands with Trump in Singapore stunned the world. For the first time, a North Korean leader was engaging directly with an American president. While these summits produced more spectacle than substance, with no binding denuclearization agreements, they served Kim's purpose. They elevated him from isolation to the global stage, portraying him as an equal to the leaders of great powers. Inside North Korea, propaganda framed these meetings as proof that their supreme leader had forced the world's most powerful nations to acknowledge him. At home, Kim Jong-un pursued a dual path, maintaining military strength while experimenting cautiously with economic modernization. He allowed limited market activity to continue, as informal markets had already become crucial for survival during the famine years. New high-rise apartments, amusement parks, and shiny urban projects in Pyongyang showcased a veneer of prosperity designed to boost morale and signal progress. Yet beneath the surface, inequality deepened. While elites in the capital enjoyed privileges, rural areas remained impoverished, and sanctions limited genuine growth. Kim also pushed a carefully crafted cultural image. His wife, Ri Sol-ju, appeared publicly at his side, breaking with decades of secrecy about the leader's family. He presented himself as a modern figure, smiling, approachable, even jovial. But behind this image lay a regime as authoritarian as ever. Surveillance, censorship, and punishment for dissent remained absolute. In recent years, Kim Jong-un has faced enormous challenges. International sanctions have tightened, strangling much of North Korea's economy. Relations with the U.S. soured after the failed Hanoi summit in 2019, where negotiations collapsed over the nuclear issue. Then came the global COVID-19 pandemic, which hit North Korea particularly hard. The regime sealed its borders almost completely, cutting off trade with China, its main lifeline. Reports suggest widespread food shortages and hardship once again, though the full extent is hidden from outside eyes. Yet, through it all, Kim Jong-un has maintained his grip on power. Despite his health occasionally becoming a subject of speculation, his rule appears secure. He continues to showcase new missile launches and military parades, reminding the world that North Korea cannot be ignored. Meanwhile, at home, the cult of personality deepens. Murals, statues, and songs praise not only him but the lineage of the Kim family, portraying them as eternal guardians of the Korean people. The Kim dynasty, now in its third generation, remains one of the most unusual political systems in the modern world, a communist monarchy, blending ideology with hereditary rule. For over 7 decades, it has defied collapse, survived famine, war, and global isolation, and even forced its way into the nuclear club. As of today, Kim Jong-un stands at a crossroads. He must balance the survival of his regime with the growing pressures of sanctions, food shortages, and international hostility. But if history has shown anything, it is that the Kim dynasty has mastered the art of survival. Whether through myth, brutality, or nuclear blackmail, they have endured, and Kim Jong-un intends to ensure that endurance continues into a 4th generation. And that's the story as history records it, and sometimes as history refuses to. Here at Prime Speaks, we investigate, analyze, and uncover the untold truths and hidden mysteries that shaped our world. Because history isn't just the past, it still speaks.